Signore e signori, buonasera. Now we are really starting. Thank you for being here with us to celebrate a huge accomplishment in the life of a dear colleague and friend, Bruce Edelstein. Thinking about this evening and what it represents, a French film came to my mind, and its title is, in English, A Very Long Engagement. And when I think about the relationship between Bruce and Eleonora di Toledo, that's what I think. They were engaged for a very long time. But finally, last spring, the marriage happened. And the marriage is actually is also with kids already. So they waited for a while, but then the result is these two fantastic volumes. Bruce, yeah, I know you don't want to do it. I should do it. One is a monography. You know, art historian, when they say they publish a book, they really publish a book. This one, it's on Eleonora di Toledo, the character to whom, the historical character to whom Bruce really dedicated 30 years of his career. And the woman responsible for creating a Medici court. She was a real princess from Spain. The Medici were kind of short on the aristocratic part in their family. And she contributed with that to create the idea of what a court should be like. You know, the Medici were the kings of understatement and of sort of hiding behind. Eleonora was not about that. And the major accomplishment of Eleonora di Toledo is the creation of the Boboli Gardens. And that's what the book is dedicated to Eleonora as an historical character, patron of the arts, but especially the Boboli Gardens. Sally, come on. And the other child that was the result of the long engagement was a beautiful exhibit at the Uffizi Gallery, totally dedicated to Eleonora and her collezionismo and her patronage of the arts. And Bruce curated the exhibit and the volume that accompanies the exhibit. Both are upstairs for you in case you want to buy them and go home with them, go home with a piece of Eleonora di Toledo. But all jokes aside about the long engagement, I've known Bruce more or less for all the duration of this engagement. Because he is a professor at NYU Florence, and he's also the coordinator of graduate studies there. And for that reason, basically, we have this good friendship that develops during the summer. And then it's silent for the rest of the year. And when I go back to Florence, it's rekindled. So it's great to have Bruce Edelstein here with us tonight to present his book. And to do that with him, there are two wonderful colleagues that we invited. And I'm going to give you something about them. One is Yvonne Ellet from Vassar College. And Yvonne is an historian of Renaissance art, but with a specialization in architecture. And the other colleague that we have is from the University of Vermont, Professor Kelley Helmstutler, who is an expert in Renaissance art, but in sculptures. So you understand already where we are going with this. We have a panel of 3 art historians, each of them with a specialty. And together we are trying to explore and to understand more about this character, Eleonora di Toledo. And who knows, maybe some of you is going to walk out of this room tonight when we leave, falling in love with Eleonora, since now she's no longer engaged with Bruce. We have some hopes. Please welcome Bruce Edelstein.
Thank you, Stefano, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to Kostya, to Julian, and to Chiara for all of the wonderful assistance in making this event happen. So Stefano asked me to say a few words about Eleonora di Toledo and to give you a little bit of a sense of what we did in Florence this past winter and spring at the Uffizi Galleries. So this is a view of the central gallery of the exhibition, Eleonora di Toledo and the Invention of the Medici Court in Florence. And Eleonora is an interesting character. She has always been famous in Florence for her portrait by Bronzino, which you can see was a star of the exhibition on the left-hand side of this image. But she was always considered really as a kind of object and not as a subject. And what I have tried to do with her over these past 30 years, and especially in the context of my new book on Eleonora di Toledo and the Boboli Gardens, and in the exhibition, was to bring Eleonora to life and to let her speak and tell us what was important to her. The portrait is extremely important to me. The beginning of my story with Eleonora, my interest in studying her, began in front of the portrait. When I was an undergraduate student studying abroad in Italy, I spent a lot of time in the Uffizi Gallery, and I kept coming back to this portrait. And later, when I was a graduate student and looking for a topic, I proposed to study her patronage. And my advisor was open to this. I remember he sent me, when I arrived in Italy, to visit a very famous professor in Italy who was Paolo Barocchi. And I went to pay homage to her at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. And she asked me what I was working on. And I said, the patronage of Eleonora di Toledo. And she said, oh, it's a vast topic. She was the only one who really understood the extent of what really was there and had been left covered and unstudied by previous scholars. I often say that my experience in front of the portrait of Eleonora di Toledo by Bronzino was not unlike that of James Stewart in Vertigo, in the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, in front of the portrait of Carlotta. These scenes were actually filmed in the Legion of Honor. The portrait, however, was a prop for the set. It disappeared. If you ever happen to find it at a garage sale in California, please pick it up because it was made by a very famous abstract expressionist artist. So it would be quite valuable. And Eleonora is iconic. She herself also appears frequently in cinema. I spotted her most recently over Queen Anne's nightstand in Yorgos Lanthimos' The Favorite, with Queen Anne and her favorite getting up to mischief under her watchful eye. And I don't want to say too much because I don't want to steal too much time from my wonderful colleagues who have agreed to come and talk about my book. But I would like to tell you a little something about Eleonora, and I think the portrait helps us because it's a window also into my own method and my own approach to studying Eleonora. When we look at this fantastic portrait, one of Bronzino's greatest works of art, one of his largest portraits, and one of his most spectacular, we can be easily misled by features of the portrait which seem to us to be standard tropes of female portraiture, but in fact are enormously revealing about both the artist's intent and Eleonora's intentions as a patron in how this official state image of her was created. She is portrayed with one of her sons. It's not her eldest son. It's her second son, Giovanni. And this is important because it has been hypothesized that this may be the very first portrait of a ruling woman with one of her children in the history of European art, something that became standard afterwards. Here is Eleonora already establishing a paradigm that would be followed for generations to come certainly at the Medici court, but elsewhere throughout Europe. And it's the second son, which also tells us something important about this because it's not about the heir. It's about Eleonora's role in securing the fate of the dynasty, in creating stability in Florence and ensuring that the Medici would survive. And there's something else about this portrait that's also very important and relates very directly to the study of the Boboli Gardens. In fact, I talk about this portrait also in the book on the Boboli, because there's something about this portrait that we might take for granted, which is the landscape setting. And the landscape setting, however, is something we shouldn't take for granted, because Bronzino never used a landscape setting in any other portrait that he painted throughout his long and illustrious career, not even of Eleonora herself. So this tells us that the landscape is important, and we should pay attention to it. And typically what has been said about the landscape in this portrait is something that is entirely logical. It's been associated with one of the great Medici estates, the villa at Poggio a Caiano, a famous, iconic building, very important in the history of architecture, which was begun for the great Medici patron, Lorenzo the Magnificent. It was left unfinished at his death, and it was completed under the patronage of another great Medici patron, one of his sons, who was the first Medici Pope, Leo X. And as we see it here in this famous image from the late 16th, early 17th century, we actually see a villa that was extensively transformed. The property was extensively transformed under the patronage of Eleonora's husband, Cosimo I dei Medici. The semi-military fortified enceinte around the villa was added at this time. The formal garden to the right of that was added at this time. The huge stables in the background that you can see here were added. The fortifications are, by the way, fake. One of them hides a tennis court and one of them hides a chapel. One of them actually didn't exist. The painter wanted symmetry. But apart from that, the villa was something very, very important to Eleonora. She spent a lot of time there. Eleonora served early in her career at least 3 times as acting head of state for her husband when he was away on missions of foreign affairs and during one of his illnesses. And this is something already that tells us that Eleonora is someone very important, not because he left the reins of state in her hand the first time, but because he continued to do so every time he was incapable of being present to rule the state. It meant that she demonstrated immediately that she was extremely capable in this role. And she chose to rule from this very building, from the villa at Poggio a Caiano, against the recommendations of male courtiers who wanted her to return to Florence because it was easier to provide for her safety if she remained in the Palazzo Vecchio, which was the seat of the court. Instead, she remained in Poggio a Caiano, and it happens that the son she's depicted with in this portrait was born at Poggio a Caiano. In addition to that, we know that Bronzino went to Poggio a Caiano to talk to Eleonora and Cosimo when the patronage for this, when the commission for this portrait was confirmed, and he wrote back to the court to say that he needed a large quantity of ultramarine, the most expensive pigment available, in order to paint the dark blue background of this picture. So all of these things led to an idea that Eleonora must be depicted against a landscape that is supposed to represent Poggio a Caiano. But does it really represent Poggio a Caiano? It doesn't look anything like Poggio a Caiano. We don't see the villa in the background, and we see over her left shoulder an aqueous background that looks like a coastal estuary. And it is very likely that what we are looking at has nothing to do with Poggio a Caiano. During this same period, both Cosimo and Eleonora started buying up large quantities of land along the Tuscan coast, along the Tyrrhenian Sea. These were malarial-filled swamps, which they began drainage projects for to recoup, to turn into valuable arable farmland, and to reduce the risks of malaria. Ironically, this is exactly what Eleonora would die of in 1562, malaria contracted in these very swamps. The portrait I'm showing you here next to Eleonora is of a very important courtier. He was their superintendent at Pisa, and part of his responsibilities were these drainage projects. And in his official portrait, which was painted by a close friend of his, who was again the court painter Agnolo Bronzino, he chose to be shown holding a map. And the map shows drainage ditches. The drainage ditches are carefully labeled. And one of the most important ones directly under his hand is marked Padule della Duchessa, the Duchess's swamp. So this gives us a very different idea of what this portrait might be about. If we imagine the portrait at Poggio a Caiano, we are thinking about something that emphasizes patrilineal descent, her husband's dynastic legitimacy, and his property, of which she would be part of that property. If instead we imagine this as relating to her own land holdings, we see this portrait in an entirely different way. Eleonora is no longer an object. She is the subject of this picture. And in fact, she dominates the entire picture. It's not about her son. It's not really about the landscape. It is about her. But it is about how it was associated very, very early on with land holdings, land reclamation, with creating agrarian estates and managing them. Eleonora, over time, would manage not only the estates, the extensive estates that she purchased herself, but she managed her husband's estates as well. 10 days after her death, in the middle of arranging court mourning and her funeral, Cosimo ordered an inventory of all of the Medici land holdings. These included her estates, but they also included his estates. He had no idea what was going on at them. They had been left under the capable management of Eleonora di Toledo. So Eleonora's relationship to the land is emphasized in this, and the portrait also, therefore, emphasizes her relationship to the Olympian goddesses, Ceres, Ops, and Cybele, but also Juno. Juno, very important here, because Juno, in her form as Juno Lucina, was a goddess of the moon who regulated not only marriage, but childbirth and the tides. Eleonora appears here like the moon against the dark night sky. She is also emanating light, like a holy image of the Virgin and Child. In fact, the whole inclusion of the landscape also alludes to this kind of sacralization of her persona. So this is a kind of window into the way that I think about Eleonora, and I hope that it gives you some idea of what kind of a person she was. In the exhibition, We opened with her framed by two of the court dwarfs, who were also, these are sculptures that were made for the Boboli Gardens shortly after Eleonora's death. And we opened with a quote. This gives you a sense of how far we've come in 100 years. A famous scholar of the Medici family who wrote a huge 3-volume history called La stirpe dei Medici di Cafaggiolo said of Eleonora that she was donna mediocre per intelligenza, di assai bassa cultura e scarsamente dotata di affetti altruistici, a woman of mediocre intelligence, hardly any culture, and barely endowed with any altruistic impulses. So I've worked very hard to undo this legacy of 100 years, and the archives tell us an enormous amount about who she was, who she did have altruistic impulses towards, who she gave money to, who she was generous to. She certainly was very keen to promote the fortunes of her own children. Eleonora was a Spanish princess raised in Naples, and one of the 7 themes explored in the exhibition was also Eleonora's childhood in Naples and how this might have affected her taste. Naples was part of the extraordinary, extensive lands ruled by the Spanish king, Charles I, Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V, and it was ruled for on his behalf by the longest reigning viceroy of the 16th century, by Eleonora's own father, who was a close associate. You see him here in a fantastic portrait relatively recently identified as a portrait of him by Titian, a gift from Titian to her father, probably in order to obtain assistance to get an income off the kingdom of Naples that had been granted to him by Charles V. And these give you some ideas of some of the kinds of things that Eleonora might have seen in Naples, things like the things that she might have seen growing up that were famous, important, and talked about, that would have molded her taste. The sculpture that you see on the left is something from the Uffizi's collections. We brought it to the exhibition, and it turned out to be something quite remarkable. We never knew that this had anything to do with Eleonora, but we certainly knew that it had something to do with the sculpture that you see on the left. The sculpture you see on the left is a masterpiece by a little-known sculptor. He's little known only because he died very young. He was Leonardo da Vinci's nephew, Pierino. And the sculpture on the left was a gift from Eleonora to her father for a very important garden that is a central theme in my book on the Boboli, because I feel that it is the true model for what Eleonora tried to achieve in Florence with the creation of the Pitti Palace and the Boboli Gardens complex. The sculpture on the right, we had no idea who owned this sculpture in the 16th century. It's an ancient fragment that was restored by Pierino da Vinci and left unfinished at his death. And in the process of creating the exhibition, we discovered that it was left without a head at the time of Pierino's death. And we now know that it was given by Luca Martini, the man who was holding the map before, who was Pierino's protector, to Eleonora. It was later completed by another sculptor, and at that point, we knew that it was in the Medici collections. This is brand new, that this sculpture was always part of the Medici collection, something Eleonora would have treasured greatly and probably intended for the Boboli Gardens as well. Eleonora loved ancient fragments that were restored. This is another charming object that she had. It's a fragment probably of an ancient Venus chastising Cupid for getting up to naughtiness. And this is, in my opinion, the most important sculpture that was created for the Boboli Gardens. Its claim to fame is that it is the first known genre sculpture created after classical antiquity, which means that it is a representation of someone wearing contemporary clothing engaged in an everyday activity. These sculptures would become enormously popular. For several hundred years, they would appear in European gardens everywhere. And the very first was made for Eleonora. And this is fascinating. Why was it made for her? What was the context for this? This is not by accident or coincidence. It has to do with her concept for the garden, which was realized in collaboration with great sculptors. First Tribolo until his death, and then Baccio Bandinelli, who was a great favorite of hers. On the right, you can see some window seats that were made for the Pitti Palace shortly after Eleonora's death under the patronage of her son, Francesco I, who did not forget that the palace had been purchased and expanded by his mother, and included in one of these a personal symbol of hers. It was a device created for her by Paolo Giovio of a peahen sheltering her chicks under her wings. It went with a Latin motto, cum pudore laeta fecunditas. And this, too, is an extraordinary thing that we had in the exhibition. The exhibition included numerous tapestries. The Medici Tapestry Works was founded after Eleonora married Cosimo I de' Medici, and we have now hypothesized a much greater role for Eleonora behind the conception of the tapestry works. This tapestry in particular is quite interesting because it comes from the most expensive set of tapestries that was woven in the early phase of the tapestry works. And yet, scholars had no idea where it was supposed to go. Our new theory is that this was intended for the Pitti Palace, for one of the rooms that was being prepared for Eleonora to be able to receive guests, which is what the Pitti was used for in its earliest phase. It was a guest residence. The artist who designed this, this is the complete set, which unfortunately we were not able to display because of reasons of condition. And the artist who designed this was someone who Eleonora loved. His name was Francesco Bacchiacca, and he decorated her terrace, from which, in the Palazzo Vecchio, which was the seat of the court in Florence, she could watch as the Boboli Gardens was being created on the opposite side of the river. And in the gardens itself, Bacchiacca was given the commission to fresco the vault of her grotto. Tapestries. Interestingly, these earliest products of the Medici tapestry works all contain her coat of arms, which you can see in the details of these. These were probably intended for her apartment, which was the earliest renovated in the Palazzo Vecchio after the Medici court occupied it. And here you can see Cosimo in a famous panel from the ceiling in the Salone dei Cinquecento in the Palazzo Vecchio in Eleonora's apartment. How do I know this? Because in the background is a bust in a niche, and we can recognize this as the famous portrait of Cosimo by Bandinelli now in the Bargello. We know that this was in Eleonora's apartment from inventories. And her apartment included, of course, the fantastic chapel created by Bronzino. Obviously, we couldn't move that from the Palazzo Vecchio to the Pitti Palace for the exhibition, but we did a pretty good job by installing one of the tapestries that was woven for her after a cartoon by Salviati in the actual chapel of the summer apartment in the Pitti Palace, together with one of the original panels, which is now in the collection of the Getty. And these are marvelous small objects that Eleonora used during her devotions in that chapel that were also on display. On the left, a painting by Gerard David that was probably a gift from her mother to Eleonora, possibly received by her mother from Isabel of Castile. She was a ward of the court, Eleonora's mother, and she was raised by Isabella the Catholic. On the right, Eleonora's Book of Hours, now in the Victoria Albert Museum. And my mini mostra nella mostra, as we said in Italian, the show within a show of almost the complete holdings of the Uffizi of works by Giulio Clovio, who Giorgio Vasari called the Michelangelo of small things. He was the greatest miniature painter of the 16th century, and when he worked in Florence, he was a guest of Eleonora's. He was the first guest in the Pitti Palace. Some of his fantastic works. And he was, they placed young, talented painters next to him to try and learn his secrets. One of them was Bernardo Bontalenti, who would later play a great role in transforming the Boboli Gardens in the next generations. And finally, the show concluded with a fantastic section on Eleonora and fashion. Eleonora revolutionized fashion in Florence. Florence had been a republic, and excessive displays of wealth were frowned upon and indeed prohibited by law. With the creation of the court, the most visible manifestation of this was in the extraordinary luxury of the costumes, and it is Eleonora who was in charge of that. She ordered her own clothes, she ordered the clothes of her husband, of her children, for the ladies-in-waiting and for members of the court, and she introduced a new kind of fashion. These fashions are often referred to as Spanish, but they're not exactly Spanish. They were Spanish fashions that were adapted to local taste, and they combined with them elements that came from the Habsburg courts of Northern Europe and from the Ottoman world, which was synonymous with luxury. This means that Eleonora was a true cultural mediator, and this is a central theme of my book about Eleonora and the Boboli Gardens, that what she was doing was importing a model that came from elsewhere, from the Spanish world in Naples, and adapting it to local Florentine taste. She created something that was extraordinary. It would later be exported on a European scale as a model for aristocratic living. And I think I will end my comments there and turn over the podium to my colleagues who are going to talk to you more about Eleonora and the Boboli Gardens.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me a few minutes to comment on my dear friend and colleague Bruce Edelstein's beautiful book. Bruce and I have been friends for a long time, and his book, I mean, his research has always intersected with my own interest. I work on Italian and Spanish artistic exchanges, especially around sculpture. But I also work on women who were rulers in Spain and what the iconography of their portraiture is like. So this book, working with, such an incredible woman who, really did function as a ruler and loved sculpture and had so many connections with Spain. I love her as Bruce does. But the other connection that Bruce and I share that was so evident to me as I was reading the book is that we were both fellows at the Medici Archive Project. And that project, if you're not familiar with it, is, especially back then in our days, I think Bruce was in the first round of fellows and I was in the second round of fellows. And for 3 years, you would go 5 days a week and read the private correspondence of the Medici family. And as a result of that, we really know these people, and we know them in ways that maybe they wouldn't even be happy with, but we really know them. And when I was reading the Boboli Gardens book, that knowledge of just Eleonora as a human being was so evident to me in a way that I've really not seen in anyone else's work but Bruce's. And it just really speaks to his really sincere respect for her, but also his profound knowledge of Eleonora, her daily life. She loved to gamble. She sounds super fun, actually, to hang out with. And, she was a lovely mother, but that's not all she was. And I really admire the way that Bruce has resurrected Eleonora's reputation as she was seen by her contemporaries, which, as you saw with that quote from the 1920s scholar, it's just been neglected in modern scholarship that women actually were so important in the early modern period. And it's really only been in the last few decades that scholars, both in Italy and Spain, and I'm sure elsewhere, have started to really think about the full totality of these women's roles. They didn't just hold down the fort while their husbands were gone at war or whatever. They actually ruled, and Eleonora is an extraordinary example of that. So as you saw, this is, just a snippet here of that gorgeous portrait of Eleonora, and this is her husband, Cosimo. And truly, reputationally, Eleonora, has been seen as a patron, but it's been really cloudy to what extent she was organizing, really, controlling both the iconography that was determined for her spaces, but also who the artists were, and we know about sort of her adoration for Bandinelli, which is not shared by a lot of people. I will be honest, me included. He's not my favorite sculptor. But she loved him and really worked to promote his work, despite the fact that he had so many detractors in Florence. Like, she clearly had a very set idea about what she wanted. And there was no messing around once Eleonora determined her will. I see Eleonora as part of this group of Spanish women, or women that were part of the Habsburg family and ended up living in Spain. And so here you have a group of some of those women, starting with Isabel, the wife of Charles V, and then Mary of Hungary as a young woman, and then as an older woman, a widow, in the bronze bust by my beloved sculptor Leone Leoni. And then Juana d'Austria, who was an incredibly formidable woman. And these were all more or less contemporary with Eleonora. Isabella was a little older, Maria was more or less the same age, and Juana was a couple of decades younger. But these women truly ruled, especially Maria of Hungary and Juana d'Austria. They were formidable rulers. Juana famously goes into battle, like she's really renowned as a rider, as someone who is fearless and really rules with a very firm hand. You may not get that from this kind of sweetened image of her where we really see her as the beauty that she was renowned to be, but also, there is this negotiation that's clearly happening in the way that women are represented for the sake of, publicity, their publics, and for posterity. Mary of Hungary, I think, is a really interesting case. She was described by her contemporaries as being like a man. She was very well learned. She was a great rider. She was a famous hunter. And she also really ruled in Hungary and Bohemia. After her husband's death, and then ends up moving to Spain. So there's something important about these women that connects them with the way that Eleonora goes into the world with the confidence and the capability of rulership. Right, the Spanish had long had these women flourish in these roles at the courts around Europe that they ruled over. What's extraordinary to me is this negotiation of the image, and in Maria de Hungary, or Mary of Hungary, and Maria of Hungary, as you can tell, all of those work for her. She is masculinized in some of her portraits in a way that I think is especially interesting, right? But she was not a mother. And so, we don't have that same sort of framing of her role as both a mother plus something, right? And with Eleonora, as we saw, that's quite different. The other reason I loved Bruce's book is because he talks about her role in, as she's really thinking about what these gardens should look like, and what they needed to contain, there is so much investment into figuring out, where objects might come from, what needs to be made new, what needs to be brought from antiquity that's been discovered. And one of those episodes involves this huge basin that comes from Elba and takes 17 years to get there. And the movement of sculpture is something I've been working on a long time. I'm quite fascinated by it. And to recognize the tenacity of these patrons in figuring out how to get these massive, delicate antiquities in particular to the court or to these new spaces they were creating shows how valuable that this was to them, not in just a sense of how much money they spent, which was a lot, but in the desire to have these objects be owned by them and be displayed in these spaces is really significant. So that I worked on quite a lot as I was working at the Medici Archive project, actually. So Eleonora is such a fascinating case to me because she has these Spanish origins. Naples was Spain's, as was much of Italy during this period. And she is, as Bruce said, a real cultural mediator. She's thinking about those influences and then melding them with Florentine traditions, but also thinking about a new image for the court that she was such an effective player in. So we see her here in this role as a mother, which tends to be the sort of focal point for women in their images. what has happened in the history of art history is that we have looked at images of women as mothers and sort of put the period right after that and not dug any deeper to see what the totality of their roles actually were. So that is what Bruce is tackling. What we know about Eleonora is that she was an incredible businesswoman. She was incredibly entrepreneurial. I come from Vermont, which is such a hot place for entrepreneurship, and Eleonora would have fit right in. She has this farm. She's interested in like organic wheat and stuff. She would have totally fit in. She could have started a whole new microbrewery, I'm positive. But what her interest in the Boboli Gardens was not just this lovely garden space, as other courts across Europe were interested in creating attached to palaces and that you just walk through them, though she fully understood the health benefits of the fresh air and the exercise that one could get in such a setting. But she was, determined to be the major provider of grain for the city of Florence. She was determined to start a winery and really started cultivating this muscatel grape that was cultivated in the Boboli Garden. So this is not just a space for like the enjoyment of beautiful sculpture. There is a lot that is invested in this land that was meant for the betterment of Florence and for her pocketbook, no doubt. The other piece of the Boboli that's so important is the role of water. So the fountains that are in the Boboli Gardens and other large bodies of water that one finds at the Boboli is not just because they happen to be there and they look pretty. It is a real display of the Medici's role in bringing fresh drinking water to the city of Florence, which is no small thing, especially when there were contagions and other things that one worried about. So this is another of these lunettes done by Utens. We saw another one of Poggiai Caiano when Bruce was speaking. And Bruce did such a lovely job in the book in really thinking about these lunettes, which have been taken as a sort of source document by previous scholars. And Bruce instead really digs in and tries to figure out the realities based in the documentary history of what these spaces actually looked like. For, as we saw with the Poggiai Caiano, where, Utens has made the choice to make things look symmetrical, even though they weren't that way. There have been some strategic pictorial decisions that are made in all of the lunettes, no doubt, that, they're lovely and they do give us a sense of the scale and the organization of space to some extent. But they're really not to be taken as documentary evidence of what the gardens looked like. And so that's part of Bruce's contribution, is really figuring out the true history of these spaces, the kinds of plants that were there, which she was very interested in. There is all kinds of exchanges of live plants and seeds that were coming from the Americas, that were coming from all over Europe. And this is a huge part of their correspondence as well. And she's very invested in having the Boboli have lots of fruit trees. And, it's, again, not just for the beauty of the area, but there is much, much more to it. In terms of her interest and her background coming from this Spanish aristocratic family, and as Bruce points out in his book, there's definitely a thread of Spanish gardens that is part of Eleonora's conception of what to do at the Boboli Gardens in terms of its display, but also in some of the plants that are placed there. And it is true in Spain. I think, Bruce, you could go into part 2 of this, of like how much was going on in Spain at this moment around new garden spaces. And Philip II was heavily into garden spaces. And as he's building the Escorial, which you see on your right there, gardens were something he was very keen to think about, and also wanted these plants. And of course, as the ruler over the Americas, he was having plants come in from the New World that he tried to plant there. But there were also these large bodies of water, like you see there, curated bodies of water that would be used, for example, to go ice skating on in the wintertime. And again, as we look at some of these spaces, we don't think about the sort of day-to-day of the experience of actually living with these spaces, but that's something you get out of doing this archival research, because that's what they talk about. Philip II would go ice skating with his children. And it's not the image we may have of Philip II. And I suspect that has also infused some of the sort of cover-up operation around Eleonora, is that, there's such a conception about Spain as being, this country where there was the Inquisition and there was no sort of intellectual life that was really flourishing there, which is completely untrue and fabricated mostly by Anglophone scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries. And that certainly has impacted how we understand these women as well. So they have double marks of being Spanish and women, right? And especially in the 19th and 20th century, as women are working hard to get more civil rights, there is a backlash, and there's more scholarship that is sort of putting these historical women in their place. Another view of the Escorial, just because it's beautiful. If you can, you can. This is one of the gardens that the Spanish crown was working on a little later than Eleonora's time. But, the Medici were sending these incredible gifts of sculpture to Spain, and Spain was sending all sorts of luxury items back to Florence, and there was a real exchange there. And Eleonora, as Bruce mentioned, in terms of her dress and her interest in dress and sort of cultural assimilation, this kind of cultural exchange is a fundamental part of that. It's showing off what your court has and can do, but it's also the way you build friendship. And, especially for the Medici family, they were totally reliant on the friendship of the Spanish crown to continue to be respected. And there were ebbs and flows of that, to be sure. But that was the ultimate goal. This instead is the Boboli Gardens. I don't know how many of you have actually been to the Boboli. I happen to be married to a Florentine, and when the Florentines, as you probably know, if you've been there, and Bruce is practically Florentine at this point, but they overestimate sometimes how fabulous Florentine things are. And my husband, when we went to the Boboli Gardens for the first time, said, "My God, there's no way we can do this in one day. These are enormous. There's no way you can traverse the Boboli Gardens in one day." You totally can. I was like 3 hours later, we're done. But anyway, so it goes. I always think of that when we go to the Boboli Gardens. It became increasingly filled with sculpture over time, and that is, of course, important. But Bruce frames that sort of iconographic trajectory that we see follow through in the Boboli Garden sculpture, rooted in what Eleonora's aims are in terms of a program. And this is no small matter that Bruce brings to light. There had previously been a sense that there wasn't an iconographic program. So, that the sculptures had no relationship with each other or to Eleonora or anything else, right? And that's completely untrue, as Bruce so well articulates in this book. One of the themes that we see here in one of these fantastical spaces in the gardens, these grottos, we see sculptures of Ceres, who, as you already heard, is one of Eleonora's sort of goddess protectorates. And, I think she's an especially important one, Ceres, because of the wheat, which, as you now know, Eleonora was quite entrepreneurial about, but also of abundance. And abundance is a really key piece of Eleonora's program. of this whole Boboli Gardens, and as Bruce articulates so well, that those connections in iconography we see also in the other spaces of Palazzo Vecchio, in her spaces in particular. So there's clearly a theme that has been made here, and anyone who knows Eleonora at all knows she's going to have a theme for something. She's not just going to do things willy-nilly. This is that same sculpture by Fancelli that Bruce showed us before, and just, Bruce does such a beautiful job in this. I mean, I can't say I love this sculpture, I'm going to be really honest with you. But it is a fascinating sculpture, and Bruce does such a great job in this book in really bringing to light the role of the sculpture as it's connected to antiquity and genre sculptures back then, but also to the working farm aspect of the Boboli Gardens, since this peasant is carrying a cask for muscatel wine that was made there. In thinking about these iconographical programs as they extend through space, from another of the grottos in the Boboli, the Grotticino della Madama, is a cycle, a little grouping that shows Capricorn and a she-goat who has swollen udders and is another sign of abundance and clearly related to maternity and Eleonora. But the Capricorn trope is something that we see in multiple iconographical programs around Cosimo I, including Amanati's Neptune fountain. There are Capricorn symbols in that, and he really tried to play up the connection to Capricorn and his role as the new Augustus. And, there's all of this iconography that is built in that's really meant to emphasize the role of Cosimo in the new golden age of Florence, and certainly Eleonora's role in that. I love this sculpture. So I sort of bring out this sculpture whenever I can, but even though this isn't a great image of it, but this is this wonderful sculpture of Morgante on turtleback. And it is, meant to connect visually, again, from Pitti to the area in front of Palazzo Vecchio, to the equestrian monument of Cosimo I by Giambologna. So these were done later, but show this connection that continues between Pitti and Palazzo Vecchio that Bruce describes in his book. But I am sure I've said way too much, but I just really hope that you will enjoy the book. It is full of, it's just written in such an accessible way, but is filled with such scholarly detail and new discoveries and corrections of the historical record that I highly recommend it to you. And I certainly compliment my dear Bruce on this scholarly achievement. Thank you. You might need to exit out. Yvonne, I should have done it for you.
I think we're okay. Got it.
We never should have done it.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I also want to express my thanks to Stefano, to Chiara, Julia, and everybody here at Casa Italiana, also to Bruce for bringing us together. And I want to offer my congratulations, especially to Bruce, also to Sillabe, on these two extraordinarily beautiful and hefty volumes. And I have, which I've obviously read, especially Bruce's book here, with great interest and pleasure. This was this morning's, the state of it this morning. And I've known Bruce for a long time. Still remember meeting him when I was a very beginning grad student and thinking how extraordinarily kind he was to me. But we have not been in the same place at the same time, mostly because my work has been based in Rome. I'm a scholar of villas. I actually didn't have a love affair with a person, but with a villa that has been going on for decades as well. And that is Raphael's Villa Madama in Rome, which is also a Medici villa. So I come to this with an interest in villas, the intersection of architecture and landscape, and particularly Medici, the dialogue of Medici villas. So I'd like to start by emphasizing that gardens are the most mutable form of art, and that the Boboli Gardens in particular are an incredibly complex palimpsest, having been enlarged and modified in many areas and significant ways over a long time. And of course, those changes are part of the long life or afterlife of any garden, and they're interesting too. But it's always been problematic to get one's arms around the early configuration of the Boboli Gardens. And moreover, there was not a static original conception for the complex, and given the many different creative agents that were engaged in such an endeavor, which is iterative and collaborative, it is very challenging to disentangle the different...
Emergency services.
I hope that's not necessary. Okay. It's very difficult to disentangle the different phases or individual contributions in a project like this. So this book sorts out and clearly shows us the rich history. And Bruce has given us an invaluable new reading of this important estate, comprising the Pitti Palace and the Boboli Gardens, focusing on the period from Eleonora's acquisition of the lands until her death, and that is from 1550 to 62, which also encompasses the death of its initial artist, Tribolo, and the resulting squabbles between Bondinelli and the Aminati Vasari factions. I would also add that the current literature on Boboli is extensive, specialized, and widely scattered. It's also almost entirely in Italian. So beyond the new scholarly research findings that this book contributes and its novel picture of Eleonora and the origins of the complex, which is what I'm going to talk about, the very fact of having an English language text on Boboli is also an invaluable contribution to Anglophone readers and to students. Now, Bruce's book gives us a new way of thinking about the Pitti Boboli estate by firmly establishing Eleonora as the patron who initiated and directed the project rather than her husband, as you've heard. And it details how she herself acquired the Pitti Palace and bought up parcels of surrounding land, acquiring over 36 acres, but it was later expanded after her death. And as Bruce also reveals, Eleonora went beyond patronage in the sense of purchase and design of the complex to function as a shrewd estate manager at Boboli and elsewhere. And she was not unique in being a woman involved in those activities, as some very recent scholarship has shown. But even so, Eleonora emerges in this book as an exceptional talent and force. She really, more than any other consort of her time, expanded family land holdings, which were important for revenue from grain sales and real estate rentals, for food, and for hunting grounds. And her wealth and financial independence were extraordinary, as was the fact that she managed many of Cosimo's land holdings in addition to her own. And strikingly, he's already told you this, Bruce proposes a new reading of her portrait, noting that watery background is, as you've heard, not the villa, but a coastal estuary and one of her land reclamation projects and drainage, which is a fascinating choice for a state portrait of this type. And it really makes this portrait at one level a portrait of Eleonora as a state manager associated with the bringing of abundance to the duchy. So, as you've already gathered, this book represents deep erudition. Even if you don't know the story, it's clearly got decades of research in it, masterfully synthesized to convey an intriguing portrait of a person and of a place, which is a real testament. And as Bruce notes, a postmortem inventory of farms, maps of drainage ditches may not sound like fascinating and compelling material, but from that and other documentary evidence, he gives us a vivid picture of Eleonora as a highly intelligent and shrewd business mind, as well as glimpses of more personal traits, such as her love of good peaches. And evidently both Cosimo and Eleonora continued the family patronage tradition of fruit and citrus trees. One of the interesting contributions of the book is the emphasis on how Boboli was distinct from other Medici estates in Florence at the time, in that it was originally a working farm for grain and grapevines, first and foremost, and the function of the formal garden was secondary. And this balance of the practical and representational is really striking. I was reminded of Amanda Lilly's path-breaking work, her writings on 15th century Florentine villas, which challenged traditional understandings of them as so-called humanist villas to reveal the economic basis of many of those landholdings, which functioned as working farms. But we tend to think that that had changed by the mid-16th century villa estates with their decorative network of sculpture and waterworks, flora and fauna, which we interpret across the broad canvas of the landscape as we do the iconography of a painting. But Bruce's book provides new evidence for the combination of the practical and the representational functions that such estates could interweave, and in the mid-16th century Florentine milieu. And as art moved outside in 16th century Italy, the gardens increasingly took on primary importance rather than the architecture, which we can see in complexes from, say, the Villa Lante in Bagnaia to the Villa d'Este in Tivoli. And Bruce positions Boboli as an important impetus for this. This Pitti Boboli estate was also an example of a very interesting typology, the urban hortus, or urban garden. And one of the revelations of this story is that Eleonora's initial idea for Boboli had little to do with the Pitti Palace at all, or its eventual function as a family residence, which wouldn't happen until a generation later. Rather, her desire was to create a garden in the city. And another of the interesting things Bruce does is to consider Boboli as what he calls a dislocated palace garden, which is an interesting term for a tradition of satellite city gardens that are a short distance from the palace. And that is, in this case, Boboli was a short distance from the ducal palace where they lived. So if this is the palace and the gardens over here, they lived right across the Arno here at what was the ducal palace, later known as the Palazzo Vecchio. He notes that this tradition of distant city gardens included Lorenzo de' Medici's sculpture garden and the garden of Eleonora's brother Luis, which he began in 1545 on the Via Gino Capponi when he was living in the nearby Medici Palace. Or we may think of the Orti Orcellari of the Rucellai. Additionally, Bruce shows how Boboli was connected to the ducal palace physically via water conduits, as you heard, and conceptually via iconography. And I found it interesting to think about parallels between that notion of the dislocated palace garden and other types of linked sites. I've characterized Villa Madama as a pastoral Vatican palace with a similar juxtaposition of urban and suburban sites, linked by iconographic connections and new physical routes, if not water, that go between them. And that is part of the tradition of the hospitium, to welcome foreign dignitaries on the edge of or just outside a city, like Poggio a Caiano or Villa Giulia, which constituted other models for satellite villas linked to city palaces. One defining aspect of the Boboli Gardens is that they've always been on the edge of the city, also connected to the countryside. And in this slightly distorted Google Earth view, you can see that they are here obviously on the edge of the center of city, the Oltrarno, with the countryside and the, beyond. And there were earlier examples in Florence, as Bruce notes, and elsewhere. And we might also think of that kind of in relation to 15th century palaces of Federico da Montefeltro in Urbino or Pius II in Pienza, both of which are palaces with their face to the city and their back to the contado. But Boboli, beyond its liminal siting, further imported elements of the countryside into the city itself. A striking example of the ancient notion of rus in urbe, that is, country in the city. And the ancients had a lot to say about the importance of country life and its advantages for health that resonated with Renaissance readers. Fresh air, especially important during ongoing intermittent periods of plague. Exercise, the benefits of looking at verdant landscape with the healing powers of the color green, and the varied diet, which is very current in relation to modern landscape studies, which are layering our contemporary concerns with health and the environment onto historical landscape studies. So Boboli brought vineyards and fruit trees, as well as a hunting park, into town. And as the book points out, hunting had been a particular Medici passion across generations, as well as a general marker of elite magnificence. And beyond that, it was understood as a form of exercise, and taking fresh air was, of course, consonant with Eleonora's passion for health, ironically, given her cause of death. So, given the size of Boboli, Eleonora was creating this rus in urbe on an imperial scale, reminiscent of Nero's Domus Aurea. And they somehow got past the negative associations with Nero's lavish lifestyle by invoking the concept of magnificence, right? That civic virtue that served to rationalize what could seem to be self-serving expenditure. So this imperial scale rus in urbe, bringing the countryside into the city, was surely an important precursor to many later examples of this, such as the 17th century Roman palace villas of the Borghese, Barberini, Pamphili, or Aldobrandini, where, as Mirka Benesch has traced, patrons imported elements from different rings of land right into the city center, from orchards to cow pastures in central Rome. The book also stresses the importance of literary sources, notably Cosimo Bartoli's brand new vernacular translation of Alberti's treatise on architecture, which treated the urban hortus, as well as Pliny the Younger's epistolary description of his Tuscan villa. And Cosimo, Eleonora, and their court drew on these and other sources and particularized their appropriations for the local geopolitical context. As the book notes, they fashioned themselves as imperial rulers in their Florentine capital of modern Etruria. Yet I was struck by the irony that they were constructing a walled, partially fortified site, which totally subverts Alberti's prescriptions. At the time Alberti was writing, right, a century earlier, patrons were following his prescriptions to ditch their fortified seigneurial compounds that symbolized tyranny for all'antica open residences that conveyed benevolent rule. Yet here we have patrons reading Alberti on the urban hortus, but fortifying it just in case. And likewise, Eleonora's early emphasis on productive farmland was intended in part for family security and safety in case of insurrection. But the evidence actually, and maybe you'll say more about this, seems equivocal for the openness of the estate. The book documents that Eleonora intended for the garden to be open to visitors in accordance with the Lex Hortorum, or garden laws, which had been promulgated in a papal bull of 1516 by Leo X Medici. And throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, in Rome, many princely cardinalate estates were open to visitors as parks. Then, after Eleonora's death, Cosimo built the enclosed corridor, right, the street in the sky that ensured safe, secret passage between the ducal palace and the Pitti Boboli estate. And he noted that the Boboli hunting grounds should only admit gentlemen and exclude rabble to prevent commercial activity. So it strikes me that it seems like there's maybe a tension about audience and access at this time of shifting political culture as the Florentine duchy became increasingly autocratic and imperial in tone. There's no slide there. There is rightly a lot of evidence, a lot of emphasis in the literature on the dialogue of Medici villas across time and space. Pope Leo X Medici and his cousin and cardinal nephew, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, later Pope Clement VII, took the imagery of Laurentian Florence to Rome, papalized it and Romanized it, and then exported it back to Florence and elsewhere in Europe. And later Medici patrons appropriated elements of their Romanized Medici forebears. And you see that at Cosimo de' Medici's Castello. But Bruce sets Boboli into a different international network, delving into Eleonora's upbringing as a Spanish noblewoman in Spain, as Kelley talked about, and from the age of 12 in Naples, where her father was viceroy, and tracing a dialogue among the network of garden complexes that her father and brothers created in Naples and also in Florence, as well as Andrea Doria's villa in Genoa. So he traces a kind of competitive dialogue of patrons in the orbit of the Emperor Charles V. Now, of course, the Florentine Medici had long had important cultural ties with Naples, and they exchanged architects and plans with its Aragonese rulers in the mid to late 15th century, as is well known. And as Bianca de Vitis has reminded us, the agency was not just one way from Florence. And in fact, Raphael, working for Pope Leo X Medici in Rome, had specifically taken elements from the Neapolitan villa of Poggio Reale as one of many models for his Roman complex of Villa Madama, notably water elements such as the fish pond. But for Eleonora, the Orti Toledani, created by her father in Naples, as well as other urban gardens of her brothers, were especially important models. And another important contribution of the book emphasizes Boboli's debt to the Spanish Habsburg heritage of gardens. As you've heard, the book sensibly sounds a note of caution in viewing the Uten's lunettes, one of the 17 famous series of Medici villas. And of course, these paintings can't be read as documentary, as Bruce emphasizes. Such bird's eye representations were often aspirational, exhortational, or perhaps imaginative projections of unfinished projects. And the very uniformity of the city, of the series, suggests kind of caution. Yet, even as scholars recognize the kind of conceptual or diagrammatic nature of these views, in the absence of other visual evidence, we often rely over heavily on these as the earliest images we have of a landscape that's been so radically changed over time that, at least it's an image. And so Bruce corrects that tendency by introducing a wealth of documentary material that he brings to bear in dialogue with the visual representations. He also treats iconographic themes of the complex, which were familiar ones: the dialectic of art and nature in the grotto, the return of a golden age under the fruitful Medici, and the power of the benevolent ruler to supply water to the populace, as you've heard. And the bringing of water was at play both at Castello and at Boboli, which kind of emerge as his and hers estates of Cosimo and Eleonora's. And as Bruce points out, it was Eleonora's Boboli that actually succeeded in supplying water to the ducal palace in central Florence, not Cosimo's. And I can't resist pointing out that this topos has been long-lived. As some of you may have seen a few years ago, when Matteo Renzi, then mayor of Florence, made a big splash about cost and recycling savings by bringing tap water to the main piazza with push buttons on the side of the Palazzo Vecchio for naturale and gassata. The The new portrait of Eleonora as patron of Boboli Gardens and her acumen at estate management keys into broader topical issues of early modern women's patronage, which Kelley talked a bit about, and in particular of gardens and landscape. Eleonora was among a handful of prominent women patrons who focused extensively on landscape. And notably, many of those were Medici women, whether by birth or by marriage. Catherine de' Medici, who frequented the Medici estates of Florence and Rome before her 1533 marriage to the future King Henry II of France, went on to create the Tuileries Gardens in Paris in the 1560s. And Sheila Folliott has noted how Catherine made her gardens a locus of female rule, proposing that the gendering of the different physical spheres, architecture as culture, garden as nature, to put it kind of reductively, was one mode for women to succeed as ambitious and accomplished patrons without being perceived as challenging patriarchal control. And Catherine, beyond creating the gardens, staged ceremonial diplomatic events there, rather than in civic spaces, transposing them from the street to the garden, which was another canny and creative mode of women's patronage. Then the Luxembourg Palace and Gardens in Paris were created by Maria de' Medici, queen to Henry IV, and Eleonora's granddaughter, who had grown up in the Pitti Boboli complex, so that her Luxembourg complex became known as the Pitti in Paris, as Bruce discusses. And garden patronage seems to have resonated with French queens and royal mistresses from the Medici queens and Diane de Poitiers and beyond. Back in Florence in the early 17th century, Maria Maddalena of Austria, wife of Cosimo II de' Medici, expanded the Boboli Gardens and created the Villa Imperiale beyond the city walls, creating what George Gorse has dubbed a Grand Duchess garden precinct, straddling the walls of Florence. In recent decades, many scholars, including Cheryl Rees, Kate Lowe, Christina Strunk, and Catherine King, among others, have shown that women indeed had far more agency and autonomy as patrons of art and architecture than was traditionally understood for this period. But I'm not sure that women as patrons of gardens and landscape in particular has been addressed as a genre. And the gendered aspects of this patronage, or not, is perhaps one vein that this book brings up for future study. That said, it can be problematic to separate gardens from architecture and even from the urban environment in the integrated design of villas, right, especially satellite villas and urban orti, which are connected to city palaces like the Boboli. So in this respect, Eleonora emerges as a patron of gardens, architecture, and even urbanism, if you will. So Bruce's new portrait of Eleonora di Toledo as a patron of Boboli and as a state manager is a fundamentally important contribution in itself, which will have a broad resonance. And the book further establishes the fundamental importance of Eleonora's Boboli as an ambitious urban hortus conceived at a pivotal cultural and political moment at the rise of absolutism across Europe, and traces how it became a model for the royal palace, or regia, integrating grand palace and expansive gardens in whatever ratio, from Caserta to Versailles and beyond. And it's an incredibly rich portrait of a patron and of a garden complex that will have an extraordinarily influential afterlife itself. So thank you for inviting me to spend time with it and with you all.
I would first of all like to thank both Kelley and Yvonne for their wonderful readings of my book. I'm so deeply honored, and of course their work has been so influential to my own. This is one of the reasons why I wanted them to come and speak, because it was a wonderful opportunity to bring together so many things. And I'm a little overwhelmed. You know, when we think about Eleonora and the garden and that lunette, when we see the lunette, which is our best image, in spite of all of its limitations, it's so different from what she herself saw. The Pitti Palace was not symmetrical at the time that she died. She had just begun ordering the great courtyard that is now the heart of the palace, and which provides that symmetrical arrangement of the palace that you see in the painting. It didn't exist at that time. There was an old Pitti house and the front range of that palace. They were connected by something that was constructed for Eleonora, and she had a kind of bridge that went from the old palace into the garden, probably to allow her to use a cart that she got as a gift from the Duke of Ferrara, so she could ride around her gardens in comfort, and to drive it all the way up to whatever rooms she was using inside the palace for her own entertainment and relaxation. It wasn't really about that very rigid formal symmetry. It was about the practical enjoyment of the gardens themselves. And Yvonne brought up this fascinating thing that I discovered late in the process of writing the book, that there really was an intention for the gardens to be available to the public. These lex hortorum that were established by this papal bull written for Leo X were meant to guarantee access to these aristocratic gardens, particularly for the opportunity for educated people to be able to enter the gardens and see especially ancient sculpture that had been discovered and displayed in these gardens. This is actually in very, very strong conflict to what was going on in the very beginning, because the first reports we have about the construction of the garden come from a Ferrarese ambassador. This is in a period in which the Medici and the Este, who were in great conflict with each other, but they were trying to resolve this by organizing a dynastic marriage. One of the Medici daughters to be married to the crown prince of Ferrara. And so there are ambassadors who've come from Ferrara, and they're writing back to their lord in Ferrara, and they're also talking about what's going on in the gardens. These people are all in immense competition with each other. And these are also other great patrons of gardens. And he says that it's not, that nobody was allowed in to see the garden in its earliest phase of development. They didn't want anyone looking during the construction. So they only wanted it to be seen at a certain point. He was given very, very special privilege. This was a way of emphasizing that the Medici were trying to enter into a kind of intimate relationship with them. And I should say, something that came up in my mind in both of your talks, Eleonora, this idea of these Spanish women not being educated, Eleonora probably did not have the education of her daughters, but something that Eleonora did was that she insisted that her daughters be given the same education as her sons. They studied Latin and Greek, and they were incredibly free women. The second and third daughter were chided at a certain point for riding around the Boboli Gardens like wild Amazons. These were women who were raised with an expectation of really great freedom and a very conscious sense of their own status and worth.
I will add that Spanish women at the Spanish court were absolutely well educated. And the access to the gardens thing is something I've thought about in relation to Spain as I was working on nude sculptures and the visibility of nude sculptures by women as they entered into different spaces, because there are writers in the 16th and 17th centuries that are saying women should not be allowed to see nudity, right? And as it turns out, nobody listened to that. And, the women were going through the gardens as they wished because they were open spaces for the public to enjoy, and plays were set there. And we have women poets and playwrights in Spain that are setting, the settings are these gardens. But is that true in Italy? I actually don't know.
It is absolutely true in Florence. In fact, one of the early literary accounts of Boboli was written by a great female poet of the court who was Laura Battiferri.
Yeah, sure.
And she wrote an eclogue on the model of Virgil's eclogues that is set in the Boboli Gardens, which emphasizes this kind of pastoral quality that is inherent to the very sculptures that Eleonora commissioned for the gardens.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I can add to that there is a letter of Isabella d'Este when she was invited to a kind of pre-opening dinner at Villa Madama. And so, of course, she kind of brags about the fact that she's gotten in. It's not finished yet, it's not perfecta. But so you get a sense of what sculptures are in place where and what she got to see. So that kind of sneak preview and telling people about it was in a way, maybe not when they were doing the drainage, the really preliminary, but that was in a way part of, I think, framing the reception of these places.
I'm really glad you brought up Isabella d'Este because some almost 30 years ago, following the very first thing I published about Eleonora, I was criticized by a senior scholar who said, "We're not talking about Isabella d'Este here." And at the time, Isabella was the only female patron we knew anything about or who was considered as someone who had actually engaged in the intellectual pursuits and conception behind artistic patronage. And we now know that there's a much broader range of the ways in which these women did these things and what they all have, though. And Isabella and Eleonora share this because Isabella, in the courtyard of her own apartment in Mantua, she had an inscription put in the courtyard, and it identified who she was, what her descendancy was. And the first thing she emphasizes is that she is the granddaughter of a king of Naples, that she's the daughter of a duchess of Ferrara, and she was the wife of a duke of Mantua. But the most important thing was that she could trace in some way her origin to Naples. It gives us also a very different sense of the importance of Naples. Naples is obviously central to my work, but Naples was the capital of a kingdom. Yeah. It was extensively ignored, particularly in the English literature, because it was a place that people didn't want to go to study. Right. But it was so important as an immense cosmopolitan crossroads, and it was the third largest city in their known world. The only cities that exceeded it in terms of extent and population were Paris and Constantinople, later Istanbul. There was nothing like it in Spain, and there was no other city on the Italian peninsula that was as large as Naples. It was an immense prize.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to, the work that you've done and, other scholars have been working on the last few years of reframing what we think about in terms of the Renaissance and where those capitals of Renaissance art making are and who's responsible for shaping these cities as they are. And that, we have so many misconceptions based on mostly Anglophile 19th and 20th century art historians that have misled us for all of these years. And we've imparted these lies to our students for decades of, women were not participant, that they were the nice women who married, were never seen again, and had lots of children until they died. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And Eleonora is not even an anomaly. So, we can't, and neither is Isabella d'Este, of course, as we know now. But it is true. I mean, that's been an enormous change that's happened in our field over the last couple of decades, thanks to brave scholars who go into the archives and relocate these histories.
Yeah, I think that contributed enormously to what our conception of the Pitti and the Boboli complex was. It exists in Florence. It is part of Medici patronage, and so it was always seen exclusively. This wasn't an aspect of its origins that was questioned, and so it was interesting to think about it. What I've tried to do with all of these things is not to divorce them from that context, but to put them into what I think was a context that was actually more important to the people who commissioned them and used them. And these are people in a different Florence. The Florence that was so popular with Anglophone scholars of the 19th and early 20th century was the Republic. Mm-hmm. And this is a different Florence. It's an early modern Florence of court culture, and it's part of an extensive world of the Habsburg Mediterranean in which all of these various potentates are in competition with each other. And the Medici are exploiting what they have available to them, which is our amazing artistic talents, to position themselves as the equals of people who had much older titles or who had greater power within in the Habsburg world.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I actually had a question for you, if I may, that came out of a few things that we were just talking about. Partly her education, partly the kind of his and hers estate. You had written that it was right before Eleonora acquired the lands for Boboli that Cosimo was reading Suetonius, that he was Raffaele Maffei's encyclopedia, sort of all of the sources that one would need to be reading for that. And it kind of made me wonder, although you masterfully demonstrated that Boboli was her commission and that she had a lot of agency and autonomy in many of their affairs, do you think there was ever any collaboration, is what I'm getting at? The whole, the question of, and I realize how difficult it is to prove collaboration, especially in the kind of work that goes on typically verbally, right? Whether you're professional collaborators or husband and wife. That those things don't end up in the documentary record, but then you get these snips sometimes like that. And I just wondered if you saw any other snips that made you think that they were collaborating on each other's estates.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, in the process of trying to bring back someone who was ignored and suppressed in history, one has to give great emphasis to that person's role. But they are each other's best collaborators. They were the luckiest noble couple of the early modern world, because most of these people had very unhappy marriages. And they, although they didn't marry for love, which was a legend about them as well, they certainly seem very, very well suited to each other. They have 11 children together, 9 of them in the first 10 years of their marriage. Once she had 2 sons, or 3, if they didn't like each other, they would have ceased with those activities. And they were very close. When we think about Castello as something separate, now there is new research that suggests quite possibly that even the grotto of Cosimo's Castello refers to Eleonora by our friend Emanuela Ferretti, remarkable new research about that. And we should also consider the fact that although the formal garden at Castello is under Cosimo's patronage, the person who's managing the agricultural estate that's around that is Eleonora. And in the Boboli Gardens, there are certainly features that Eleonora included for her husband's pleasure. Most important was the pallacorda. This is an early form of tennis. He's passionate about this. When he can, he reroutes the route of the court to stop off when someone has one of these courts so he can play. And one was built, actually, the room where you could see Eleonora's portrait in my exhibition is probably where the tennis court originally was. As the palace expanded, certain features of the garden disappeared. And that caused the destruction of the Gioco della Pallacorda. And there were other features that Cosimo was certainly interested also. You brought out so well this tension between the idea of openness and access to the garden and the fact that it's also a walled enclave. The garden was also built for security, and one of the features that is eventually makes that explicit, which you can see so clearly in the Uten's lunette, is the construction of the Forte del Belvedere at the summit of the garden. At that point, once they had the Vassar corridor that connected the palace to the garden, you could come across the corridor without anyone seeing you. You could scamper up the hillside. You could be inside an actual fortress with a garrison of soldiers, and you had a food supply and water supply available to you. You could stay there quite comfortably for a significant period of time during an insurrection of the people. And so that was also an aspect of this that was certainly important to him. And Cosimo was passionate about hunting. So when she creates this also as a hunting enclave, I think she's thinking about what they all enjoy doing. Something fascinating about Eleonora, we think about her with all those children and then subsequently having a respiratory illness that was probably a form of tuberculosis, that she was constantly lying down and ill. But she's riding with him at the hunt. They go fishing together. So she's engaged in these sporting activities as well. She enjoys doing these things. And the fact that she's an accomplished equestrian is important in this culture. Your ability to manage a horse is considered also a representation of your ability to manage the state.
Yeah, one thing that came out so vividly from the exhibition and from this is their partnership, the strength of their partnership, how complementary the two of them were. I mean, it really was an extraordinary match of kind of complementary skills and obviously great mutual trust, shared values, shared kind of agency in things. And I completely understood that the goal of the book is to establish her agency, which had always been in question. But I thought that the exhibition, you got to see that kind of portrait of a partnership in really striking ways.
Yeah, this comes out also in the book on Boboli. For example, at Pisa, Pisa was a depressed city. It had the population had declined, and Cosimo engages very actively to revive the city. He makes it into an open port long before Livorno was for free worship. So Jews and Eastern Orthodox Christians were welcomed, and he reestablishes the university. And Eleonora invests in the commercial activities that are also supposed to contribute this. They create a sugar refinery. And I sometimes like to think of her as maybe engaging in something sort of like insider trading. She knows where these things are going, and she can put her money securely into things she knows are going to be successful.
I have one more question, and that is, having worked on Eleonora over such a long period of time, how did your view of her change over time? I mean, were there surprises? I mean, obviously you went into this, I'm always going to picture you, like the portrait of Carlotta Bisotted as a grad student, but you went into this interested in her and understanding that there was a story to tell about her patronage, but over this long time to percolate, what has surprised you or changed your portrait?
I certainly started with her also as really seeing her as an object, as the beautiful person represented by Bronzino in the portrait. And it wasn't until I spent all that time, as Kelley was saying, when you spend all that time in the archives and you're reading these people's letters or the letters of other people around them who talk about them, you discover all kinds of things about them. And the first really surprising thing was that she really was managing not only her own estates, but also Cosimo's. And how much she was engaged in statecraft. And in the last phase of working on the exhibition, it also became very clear how privileged she was in relation to the Habsburg court. Cosimo's title, Duke of Florence, comes from the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So they are dependent on this world for everything. But the person of privilege who's receiving the gifts, the things that establish absolute privilege, is Eleonora. She receives a Hungan horn, hunting horn, as a gift probably from Moulay Hassan, who was the king of Tunis. She receives one of a very, very early example of a Mixtec mask from New Spain, Mexico. Those were not things you could buy on the open market. You could only receive them if you were of such a high level of privilege that someone who had access to those markets decided to offer you one. And she is the recipient of those kinds of gifts. She is the absolute connection to this world of authority and power.
What would Cosimo have been without her? I mean, you really have to wonder.
As usual.
Cosimo had two women. He had his mother, who was also fantastically important. His father died when he was very young, and with an iron fist, she maintained his estates, and she went to propose him to become Duke of Florence when he was 17. He was off hunting at the Medici villa at Trebbio. She goes into the city of Florence and suggests that they ought to make him Duke when his cousin was assassinated. And then he lucks out with Eleonora. So he has these two women who really do define his life. According to ambassadors, Cosimo had no relations with other women during their lifetime, and that was not ordinary in this world. And I think it really is another expression of the deep respect he had for her position. It wasn't just a manifestation of love or affection. In this world of marriage, in which marriage is not based on love, marriage is a contractual arrangement about consolidating power and money, he recognizes her superior status and the necessity to behave with respect towards her.
Bruce, una domanda. See, that line that you read from that 1920 art critic,
The bad press, right? And I was wondering, first of all, what is this bad reputation that she acquired due to? In the example of Caterina de' Medici, it's very clear she was accused of being part or the mind behind the conspiracy to kill all the Protestants and the embodiment of the Machiavellian ideas in France. But for Eleonora, there doesn't seem to be any ideological prevention. So did you also find good press about her? And were you able to find the reasons why they were trying to, some of these people were trying to paint her still, like 400 years later, with these dark colors?
That's a wonderful question, Stefano. It starts in her own lifetime. So, when Cosimo came to power, there were, following the assassination of his cousin, who was the first Duke of Florence, there were many people in Florence who thought that a republic might be reestablished, and who were essentially anti-Medici. These people deeply hated the Spanish for two major episodes. In 1512, the sack of Prato, which was horrific, and where the future Pope Leo X, as Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, was at Prato overseeing the devastation that was wreaked upon the city. It was so horrific what the Spanish troops did there that Florence capitulated at a distance just to ensure that the troops wouldn't come into the city. And they remember these things 30 years later. Less than 30 years later. Then, again, in 1529, the Siege of Florence was enacted by Charles V to return Florence to Medici power after it had thrown the Medici out following the sack of Rome in 1527. And again, this was done by Charles V, and it was done by what were perceived as Spanish troops, regardless of where they came from. And so there was a deep-seated hatred of the Spanish. And there's a fantastic diary from the period of Cosimo and Eleonora, which gives us wonderful information. This was written by probably a late follower of Savonarola who hated the Medici. And every time he describes Eleonora, he says something horrible about her. But even he, in his way of saying, he says, it was remarkable to see someone so haughty as she on the streets of Florence. You had never seen a woman of such great, haughtiness. But at the same time, he's also expressing admiration, in a way, for her aristocracy. And this is the point. These were people who were opposed to the idea of the establishment of a hereditary court. What she is actually doing is to establish the idea of an aristocratic court, of an expression of the principle of magnificence derived from Aristotle, which was exploited extensively by these people in the Renaissance, in contrast to everything that should be promoted, of course, by the ideas of Christian charity and modesty.
Thank you. Is there another question?
Just a comment, Professor Edelstein, just to note that for her to have 11 children and to not succumb to, I don't know what the mortality rate for a delivery was of a child, but think of just the exquisiteness of that from an obstetrical standpoint, which is not at all what we're talking about today. But I just wanted to know that that's amazing. And I did have one question, which was also, forgive me if this is in the book and I missed it, but about how they came together as a couple. How did Cosimo, who certainly was elevated thanks to his mother securing that position, but he seemed to have fallen up even further by, so how did that match come about? Did his mother arrange that too, or something?
That's a wonderful question. So, Eleonora doesn't live very long. She only lives 40 years, which is not a young age by Renaissance standards. Infant mortality rate was very high, and so was the rate of death for women in childbirth. This was an extremely dangerous and fraught environment. And as I say, she has 9 children in the first 10 years of her marriage and 2 more afterwards, 11 children. This certainly took a toll on her health as well. So how did they meet? The legend is Cosimo, before he became Duke, was serving as a page in the court of his cousin Alessandro, who was Duke of Florence. And Alessandro, when Charles V was triumphant at the Battle of Tunis, he makes a kind of giant progress through Italy on the model of ancient Roman emperors, and he spends the winter of 1535-1536 in Naples, where Eleonora's father was viceroy. Eleonora had arrived a year and a half before. She's a child. She's quite young, although really not a child by Renaissance standards, but quite young. And the legend has it that Cosimo and Eleonora saw each other on this occasion. They fell madly in love, and later he wanted to marry her. Nothing could be further from the truth. Pedro, Eleonora's father, was terrified that something untoward would happen to any of the women with all of the massive quantities of foreign visitors to Naples. This was always a grave concern, that the guests would get drunk and something inappropriate would happen to some noblewoman. So he took great efforts to ensure the separation of men and women at various events, although they were brought together under certain social occasions. We cannot imagine that he let his young teenage daughters wander around unchaperoned during these events. They probably never even saw each other. Later, when Cosimo becomes Duke, first he has to get confirmation of the title from Charles V. That takes about a year and a half. And then he starts looking for a bride. And his ambitions are high. The first thing he tries to do is to marry the widow of the first Duke of Florence. So not Eleonora. It's Margaret of Austria, who was the illegitimate daughter of Charles V. And he's deemed not high enough status for this. She's given to the grandson of the reigning Pope, Paul III, who she detested. She had twins with him and then had no more children. For an entire month, the entire College of Cardinals had to beg her to consummate the marriage. Then Cosimo moves on to try and maybe secure one of the Tudor princesses or the Duchess of Milan. He doesn't get any of these marriages. His status isn't high enough. It was Pedro who came forward at the court to offer one of his daughters and one of his remaining unmarried daughters, the two youngest. And Eleonora was the younger of these two. He was trying really to marry off the older, whose name was Isabella. But Cosimo receives lots of letters from his agents in Naples, and they're in code. When you decode them, you discover that they say things like, absolutely insist on the younger daughter, the older one is ugly, she's of an ugly age, and her brain is considered the scorn of Naples, il ludibrio di Napoli. This also confirms that he had no idea how to distinguish between these two women if he needed all of this information. And he insists on marrying the younger daughter. They agree to an immense dowry, which, contrary to the principles of a dowry, was not actually going to be supplied by her father. It was only partly going to be supplied by him. And the rest had to be supplied by Cosimo himself. And this is fascinating in relation to the history of Boboli, because it's probably in relation to this, since the dowry is never actually conferred, that Cosimo establishes a certain level of indebtedness to his wife, so much so that shortly before she buys the Pitti Palace, he's constrained to offer her an annual income off the salt tax in Naples of more money than he earned annually as Duke. She's fabulously wealthy. She loans and borrows money. The person who is her greatest debtor is her own husband. So she's bankrolling everything, and this also gives her the opportunity to buy all of these lands and to engage in this kind of patronage.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much.
Ancora una domanda, perché chiudiamo.
E poi chiudiamo.
Thank you. I actually have two questions, but I'll just, in the interest of time, just ask the simpler one. Many references have been made to Eleanor as this leader and even ruler when her husband was away numerous times. I wondered if you could point to any specific decree or law that asserts what you're claiming as her ability to rule the city itself. Were we just talking about her own estate as her potency?
No. Cosimo, early in their marriage, she and Cosimo are married in 1539. And one of the problems that Cosimo had early in his reign was that although he had been recognized by Charles V as Duke of Florence, Charles was cautious about his ability to actually rule the state. So he kept control of the fortress of Florence and of all of the fortresses of the Tuscan state. So Cosimo goes, shortly after he marries Eleonora, on a diplomatic mission to Genoa, where Charles had just arrived, to plead his case to be given control of his own fortresses. And he leaves the state explicitly in the hands of Eleonora during that. That's the first regency that she serves. It was an unsuccessful diplomatic mission. 2 years later, he goes and he tries again. He goes back to Genoa, and when he does so, he leaves the reins of state in the hands of his wife. She has male advisors who are members of the bureaucracy of the court, but she is in complete charge. She astonished them during the first regency, because when he goes off to Genoa and they've left the state in the hands of this woman, the troops that defend Florence, who are mercenary soldiers, think, oh, this is our opportunity. We don't have anyone powerful now over us. They threaten to invade the city of Florence. They demand more food and higher wages. And the male courtiers are all advising her to give in to this because they're terrified that these guys are going to descend on the city of Florence. And with an iron hand, she says no. And she actually threatens to cut their wages. She's a very tough, powerful negotiator. She probably learned how to do this, by the way, from her mother. We know that her mother also once served as regent for the Kingdom of Naples, of which her husband was viceroy, during a period in which he had to go suppress a rebellion in Puglia. He was a great military leader, and he went off with an army to go do this. He left the control of Naples in the hands of Maria Osorio Pimentel. So Eleonora witnessed this in her childhood in Naples. She had an example to learn from. And she demonstrated great ability in this area. So at least 3 times she is explicitly confirmed as head of state. In 1541, in 1543, and then in 1545. The third time was because Cosimo was ill. They thought he might die. And he was incapacitated. He was not able to rule. It was brief, fortunately. But she served as regent then. My hypothesis, which I can't demonstrate, is that in the second half of her reign, in the period in which she was developing the Boboli Gardens, Cosimo was much concerned with the rebellion that had taken place in the neighboring state of Siena. And they are bankrolling the imperial army that is trying to return Siena to imperial control. Eventually, the Spanish crown becomes so indebted to the Medici over this that instead of paying them back, they decide to cede the state of Siena, and this leads to Cosimo's reign, lands becoming doubled. He becomes Duke of Florence and Siena. And while Cosimo is doing this, I suspect that much of the day-to-day management of the state was under the watchful eye of Eleonora, but she was not made explicitly regent during that period.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bruce, I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that it's amazing how something so many centuries ago could today be exactly what she had originally wanted it to be. And that's what's so great, is that maybe in the 19th and early 20th century, they had negative things to say, but today I don't think you could have an eye or a person say anything negative about how that Boboli Gardens came about.
That's wonderful. I think one of the reasons we are this generation of scholars, we've been so keen to study these women, is because they tell us so much about this period. They really did have this kind of authority and contributed so much to the establishment of a culture we admire so greatly. But it tells an important story. It tells an important story for our students. We want them to know about what I find so particularly fascinating is that this was a period in which, in theory, women were not supposed to have power and authority. But what we discover is that they find ways to get around the prescriptions against those things, and they do manage to concentrate extraordinary power in their hands, at least at this elite level of society. And I think that's a lesson for all of this generation about finding ways to establish your own authority and to achieve the things that you want for yourself.
And I'll just say add that one thing you didn't say in the book, but that I was left with, was a slightly elegiac feeling that for all of her agency, her brilliance, her creativity in launching the Boboli, that she didn't live long enough to enjoy the fruits of what she actually had envisioned, which of course isn't a common Renaissance story given life expectancies and how long building projects take. But that kind of rus in urbe, or with the children in the villa gardens, she didn't quite get to see what it was. So it feels like a gift to us, right? That we can now go enjoy the fruits of all of that.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.